Okay, so first of all, thank you for the opportunity to talk with you this afternoon. I've been asked kind of the generic, well, talk about biostatistics. And rather than just talk about biostatistics with a lot of formulas and sample size calculations, I thought it would be better for me to focus on how you can work with me and others in the Biostatistics Shared Resource to help you with your research design and grant development. And I know in looking at the screen, I know several of you are already working with biostatisticians in the shared resource. Um, but this is for those of you who aren't, to kind of let you know the best way to approach that collaboration and also our roles. So I like this picture because I think it's very indicative of what all of us need to do in terms of developing grants and proposals. Note that first of all, it is not a paved road, it is a dirt road. So that means that you have to at times go a little bit slower because there may be some ruts and there may be some moisture on the road. The other thing is it's not a straight road. There are curves and there are when you get to the other side, there may be a drop off. And so I think this is a good metaphor for what it's like with respect to proposal development. So my goal is to spend about 40 minutes or so just kind of talking about the different roles of the investigators and the statisticians in terms of developing a grant proposal, and then to talk with each of you, not knowing how many would be here. I said, well, about 3 to 5 minutes of kind of what your research focus is and your next steps, kind of where are you? I know some of you have submitted your own grants, others haven't, so that then that just helps us move forward. It also helps the others hear where you are. So the first thing I want to do is to demystify the process of consulting with a statistician. I'm sure many of you have been told, oh, you need to talk to a statistician. And first of all, you don't know any statisticians. It's not like, well, this was when we used to be able to have parties, but it's not like the average person you talk to at a party says, oh, I'm a biostatistician. That happens probably fairly rarely in most of your circles. But to kind of just demystify the process, then I'll talk about what you need to bring to the collaboration, because it's really important for you to understand what I need from you. Then I'm going to focus this on a grant application because that's the easiest thing to talk about. So I'm just going to remind you of the importance of the specific aims page. I'll talk about what I bring to the collaboration, the grant sections that I prepare, and the statistical landmines to avoid in grant development. So as I go along, I can either turn on the chat. Well, the chat is on. So if you want to type a question into the chat, that's fine. Or if you want to just interrupt and ask a question, that's fine too. So let me start. I have several slides on what you bring to the collaboration. And it starts with the hypothesis. If the study is successful, what do you want to show? In other words, how do you want to move the field forward? This may seem like it's straightforward, but I have read many grants, in fact, where there's an unclear description of the hypothesis, what it is the investigator is trying to show. There may be a very elegant sequence of experiments, but there's no big picture overview. And we'll talk about the specific aims, how important they are, but they are the way that you propose to address your hypothesis. So your hypothesis is more overarching. Your specific aims are how you're actually going to do it. The significance. Virtually all grants start with a significance section. And as a colleague said to me the other day, you need to hit your reviewers very early as to why this is important. What will change if your proposal is successful? And this is what you need to talk with me about as a statistician also. What is already known? What are the studies that have already been done, and what are you trying to add? That's particularly important because, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, your grants are going to be scored based on their impact. And if the consensus of the reviewers is that you have a low impact application, it will not be scored well. Or if it's just seen to be an incremental improvement. So you need to start with what's already known and then add on why it's important. It is important to discuss whether the previous studies are scientifically rigorous. And in particular, one of the things to look out for is, have they focused solely on a particular sex, a particular age group, a particular ethnic group, especially if you want to expand the research to a different ethnic or racial group. And then what you need to help me with is, what do you expect based on the current literature? And it really helps me if you can provide a paper or a published article that either measures the outcome you're interested in, or you have some pilot study results. I'm sure you've already discussed this, but as most of you know, if you want to submit an R01, you have to have some preliminary results. And I shouldn't have to say it, but it's important for you to make sure that those preliminary results have been analyzed appropriately. I reviewed a grant last week in which they were trying to show that the combination of two agents was better than either agent alone. And unfortunately, in their preliminary results, they had not done the appropriate analysis. So that, from my perspective, that meant that even their preliminary results were not rigorous. So that led me to question the scientific rigor of their grant. So questions about significance. What is the innovation? What is novel about your study? This is another score driving criteria, is how innovative is your proposal. That means you need to make time for a thorough literature review. I serve on I'm a standing member of a study section, and a grant is not reviewed favorably if the applicant has said, well, this is very innovative, we're the first ones to study this, and the reviewer says, well, no, it was actually published 3 years ago. So make sure that you know what's novel about your study, and that's why it's so important to have others in the field read your grant before it's submitted, because they may know the literature better, and that way you can make sure that your statements about innovation are reasonable. So for me, from a statistical perspective, the part I help with the most is your approach. How will you address your hypothesis? I have seen grants rated very well with respect to significance, innovation, investigators, and then when it gets to an approach, it's down to a 6, 7, or 8, and that will basically sink your grant. So for those of you who are doing population-based research, which is the focus today, you need to very carefully specify your target population, your inclusion criteria, and your exclusion criteria, the primary and secondary outcomes of interest. And this is where a very good figure can really help to cement the approach that you're going to use. And I'll show you an example a little bit later. Now, you should have at most one or possibly two primary outcomes of interest. And you need to be very clear how it's going to be measured. From a statistical perspective, we do prefer hard endpoints, things like BMI, weight, waist circumference, or in cancer clinical trials, survival. If you want a behavioral endpoint, something like sleep or something like distress or stress, you should use a validated questionnaire, but be careful as to whether or not it's been validated in your study population. For some of you, you may not be able to use validated questionnaires in your study population. And if that's true, it's just important for you to acknowledge that, that no one has validated this questionnaire. And I will caution you against developing your own questionnaire, because this is a lot harder than you think. I see people on the call who have expertise in behavioral interventions and their assessment. And to develop a new questionnaire or to validate a questionnaire takes a lot of work. And that, in fact, can be a grant submission in and of itself. Then what are the secondary outcomes and how will they be measured? And you should limit the number of secondary outcomes. If you have a clear hypothesis, then it will be clear what your primary hypothesis, your primary outcome needs to be, and the secondary outcomes. So let me stop for a minute and ask for questions.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
So if we're working specifically for a tribal nation and the validated surveys or questionnaires are not applicable to that particular target population, is it okay to write in there that that it will be pilot tested and be revised based on the cultural relevancy and literacy level of the target population?
Yes. Yes, I think that is very appropriate. And I know we have people on this call who have a lot of experience with that. The question is, that's very appropriate depending on the grant mechanism. Something that might be a good mechanism for an R21 or an R03, a smaller grant. Remember, an R21 is high risk, high reward. But certainly if you're submitting an R01, they would expect you to have validated, your questionnaires. Does that make sense?
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah. And Francine, if you're on, do you mind if I ask you to respond to that also?
Sure. And so working with tribal communities is unique in that many existing instruments may not have been validated working with tribal communities. And so Denise can probably speak to this a little bit more, how that is viewed in a review session, a peer-reviewed session. But that's probably something that you want to put in your grant proposals, the unique population that you're working with, that some of these instruments may not have been validated, and that is going to be part of your research approach, and that those processes kind of need to be included in what you're proposing to be doing. So I think those are really important things to be thinking about. And not only that, but when you're working with tribal communities, a lot of the existing instruments or assessments need to take into account the cultural implications of the work that you're doing, some of the cultural considerations that you need to be making. And so those also need to be weighed in, not only to your approach, but also the analysis. And so that would be something that you would need to communicate with Denise or any other statistician that you might be working with, because it does have bearing on the type of analysis adjustments that they have to do. And if you're working with multiple tribes, that also weighs in as well, because we know that each tribe is different. And so the variability between the different tribes would also need to be considered.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Francine. I knew she could express it better than I can from a statistical perspective. But yes, it's just really important, because anytime you use a questionnaire, you want to make sure it's measuring what you think it's measuring. And as most of you know, for a long time, the only thing we knew about heart attacks and heart disease was in older white males, because that's who was in the studies. And, so of course it didn't necessarily generalize to even white females, let alone males and females of color. So it's just important that you think about who your population is and what is already known about questionnaires in that population. That's why, as a statistician, when I say we prefer hard endpoints, well, BMI is BMI, it has different connotations, but it's something that can be measured the same way in different settings. So that's an example of a hard endpoint. Okay, other questions? Okay, now what are the specific aims? Your specific aims page is one of the most important pages in your entire grant application, and it's worth taking the time to write it well. It should include your hypothesis, a paragraph of your background, a few sentences about the innovation, the specific aims in detail, and the impact. Hit the reviewers right away with what the impact of your proposal is going to be. You should draft your specific aims first. I've worked with one collaborator for years that sets aside a month before she even starts writing the grant to draft the specific aims and the specific aims page. But then as you develop the approach, you may need to go back and refine your specific aims, because, and especially as you develop the budget, you may realize that part of what you proposed may not be feasible within either the grant period or within the grant budget. Definitely you should allocate the time to have others read your grants before they're submitted, but in particular, do not have misspellings on your specific aims page. It just comes across as a sloppy investigator, and a sloppy investigator means they're less likely to fund your grant. So it's worthwhile spending a lot of time on your specific aims page. And I know you will probably have workshops throughout your time with NACP about how to develop a specific aims page. Now, these are the common mistakes I've seen in specifying specific aims. One is people confuse a process aim with a hypothesis. So I have seen multiple times that the first specific aim is we're going to assemble a cohort. That's a process. That's not a scientific hypothesis. That's part of your approach. It's not one of your specific aims. The other thing I've seen happen is combine specific aims. So for example, to test the efficacy of the intervention on changes in BMI and its feasibility and acceptability to the study population. That's actually 3 outcomes. And in fact, it would be better to have, say, your primary outcome be the change in BMI, and then your secondary outcomes to assess feasibility and acceptability. In fact, if you have a planning grant, in your planning grant, the feasibility and acceptability may be your primary outcomes, and the efficacy would be a secondary outcome, because you know your sample size will not be large enough to be able to have an efficacy outcome. So are there questions about specific aims? Okay, so what do I do? Okay, so that's what you bring. So basically, I'm hopeful that when we either talk via Zoom right now, or when we, when at some point in the future we're able to meet, you know, either in my office or, you know, still for those of you at NAU remotely, that's what I'm hoping you will bring to the conversation. So that my goal is to translate your research goal into a statistically testable hypothesis. And that's why I need to know what the outcome is, because you will be coming to me for 2 things. The first is you'll be coming to me for a sample size justification, and the second is the statistical analysis plan. How I determine the sample size justification depends on your outcome. So that's why it's also important that you know in advance whether you'll have a fixed sample size. In other words, if you're in a clinical situation, the number of patients you can see within the next year, or a non-fixed situation where you have an idea as to the number that you may be able to recruit, but in fact, you don't know for sure. Now, I always like to work with biostatisticians. I always ask you to work with me early. And that's because I need to understand your study design. And if, for example, you're working with me for the first time, I will spend a lot of our meeting just asking you questions, because that's the way that's what I need to understand what you're trying to do. And then often you need the required sample size to be able to complete the budget. I don't know how it is at NAU, but at U of A, I know they want the budget routed often at least a week or 2 before the grant itself is submitted. So in that sense, we need to already be working on the sample size justification so that you're able to complete the budget. So that what do I do? Well, I'll talk to you about how I propose to analyze your data, because that is what determines the necessary sample size for a given power and difference to be detected. And then my role is to develop the statistical considerations and sample size justification. Now, NIH is continuing to emphasize both sex and age as biologic variables. I know most of you are doing population-based research. Sometimes when I work with investigators that are doing animal experiments, they'll tell me things like, well, we only like to use female mice because the males eat each other up. And the answer to that is, well, no, usually you would need to include both male and female mice. Unless you're studying a particular disease that occurs only in women or only in men, you should definitely include both sexes. And I recently reviewed a smaller pilot study in which they could only accrue 15 participants within a year. They said, well, we're going to let the sex distribution reflect the distribution in the population of this particular disease. And that would have meant 11 males and 4 females. And I suggested for 15 subjects that they select 8 and 7. There would be no reason to have such a small number of females. So that's something that you need to take into account. Okay. So let me just briefly review how we do sample size and power justification. And I promise there are no formulas and I won't make you do anything by hand. But remember, we have an alpha error, which is typically 0.05, which is when we conclude that we have a difference or an effect, when in reality there is no difference. What we're interested in is minimizing the beta error, which is when we conclude there's no effect when in reality there is a difference. The power is 1 minus beta, which depends on the statistical analysis approach, so that we select our sample size so that the power is typically 80% or 90%. It is important, if you're going to have interim analyses, that you adjust for that in your sample size justification. And also, if you're going to have multiple primary endpoints, you should adjust for that in your sample size justification. So, general questions about power and sample size. I'll show you an example next. Okay, so here's just a straightforward example. We're interested in a new approach to smoking cessation. We know that the current approach leads to a smoking cessation rate of 15%. We want to improve it to 30%. In other words, we want to double the smoking cessation rate. We're going to have a randomized clinical trial, which means we will randomize participants to standard of care or our intervention. And we want the sample size to be large enough that our study will have at least 80% statistical power. Well, here's a table. This is a 2-sample test of proportions. We want to detect an improvement from 15% to 30%. And what you immediately see is to have at least 80% statistical power, we have to have 140 participants in each one of the arms. And if we want over 90% statistical power, we would need to have right around between 170 and 180 participants in each one of the arms. Well, if you come back to me and say, but I can only accrue 100 participants per arm, well, you see that that would only give you 72% statistical power. So to get to 80%, you would need to hypothesize a larger effect of the intervention. You will have difficulty changing the standard of care arm. So instead, what we would do is we'd need to have a success rate in the treatment arm of 32%. So we would still have 80% power. So we need to hypothesize a larger difference. So instead of 15% versus 30%, we would need to hypothesize 15% versus 32%. So questions about that? Okay, so that in the sample size and power justification, I will carefully define the assumptions you've made. I will try to use pilot data or results from the literature to justify your assumptions. And I need to provide enough detail so that the biostatistical reviewer can match your calculations. That's particularly important for those of you who are developing clinical trials that will be reviewed by the Cancer Center Scientific Review Committee. On that committee, the statisticians will try to match your calculations to make sure they're correct. And they typically also do that in any grant reviews. So then I also draft the proposed statistical analysis plan, What I try to do is I go through each one of your aims and sub-aims, and I discuss the statistical approach for each one. That's why it is very difficult for me if you say, well, you can only have one paragraph. You may be cutting yourself short on the review if there's not enough room to really lay out the scientific objectives and how they're going to be tested, so that I will clearly state the primary outcome and all secondary outcomes. When I review grants, that's how I can tell whether it's a generic statistical consideration plan versus one that's been tailored to the grant. I'll summarize the proposed analyses. I'll discuss sex and age as biologic variables, and then I will talk about potential biases, in particular the concern about missing data. And this is particularly true when you have a longitudinal study in which you're following individuals across time. Okay. So I just listed some of the statistical landmines to avoid, and I'm also going to open it up to the other senior investigators to share some of their own. I have seen grants with no sample size justification at all. They just say, well, we'll accrue 20 subjects, and there's no feasibility as to whether that will allow them to detect anything of statistical importance. If it is just based on feasibility, in particular, if you're submitting a pilot grant, you can state that, but then you still need to show what you will be able to detect. I've seen investigators say, well, in our previous studies, we've been able to detect significance with 50 people, so that's what we'll have in this study. Well, that's not an appropriate rationale, because the endpoints may have changed, your sample may have changed, so it shouldn't just be based on your previous experience. It is important that the analysis plan should be tied to each aim. And then in many cases, I see a very naive statistical analysis plan. If you're going to have longitudinal measurements, your analysis plan needs to adjust for that. And in particular, I'll show you an example in a minute in which we have clustered observations. Your analysis plan also needs to adjust for that. So I'll open it up to see if some of the other senior investigators have other statistical landmines that they've seen. Well, that means your statisticians are doing a good job. I have had people say to me when I review on study sections that in some cases, they read the specific aims page and then go to the statistical analysis plan, because that tells them exactly what the investigator has conveyed in terms of what they're going to be assessing. So that's why it's that important. Okay. Now let me just run through an example to kind of solidify some of these concepts. This is actually an R21 that I was involved with Dr. Melanie Hingle, who's in the Department of Nutrition and Mezcov. This was a single-arm study. It was a YMCA-based type 2 diabetes prevention program for overweight and obese 9 to 12-year-old children and their parents. In the R21, remember, an R21 is high risk, high reward. So with the amount of funding available, we had an initial sample size of 60 parents and children to allow for 20% attrition. And the program was based on previous results in a YMCA-based childhood obesity program. This gets into being really clear what your target population is. We didn't do a clinic-based childhood obesity program. We looked specifically at a YMCA-based program. Okay. We had face-to-face delivery that was led by YMCA lifestyle coaches and a hybrid delivery with alternating face-to-face and mobile device delivered content. For the purposes of this pilot analysis, we combined the two modes, and in fact, there was very little difference between them. We had a pre-post design, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but the primary analysis was just based on the paired t-test. For the change in BMI Z-score, the reason we use BMI Z-score is because these were 9 to 12-year-old children. We needed to account for their age and their sex in terms of changes in their BMI. Because since they're growing, you would expect all children to increase their BMI. So that we use the BMI Z-score, and there are programs on the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention website that will allow you to compute the BMI Z-score. And then we did exploratory analyses to compare the differences between the formats. We ended up with 48 children, 45% female, 54% Hispanic, 87% obese. Of that, 36 families completed the post-intervention measures. And we averaged 61% with respect to our program attendance. What did we show? There were significant changes in the child BMI Z-score at 12 weeks. And there were significant changes in the family, food, and physical activity environment. So they felt the families felt that they had improved environments in these areas. And the participants and the lifestyle coaches highly rated the content and engagement strategies. So then that was our pilot data. Let me talk for a minute about the advantages and disadvantages of a pre-post design, because I know for those of you who are writing pilot studies, this is a very attractive design. It can allow assessment of the feasibility and acceptability of an intervention. You can get a preliminary assessment of whether the intervention leads to a significant change, and more importantly, it can provide estimates of the effect for the design of a future randomized trial. The disadvantages is you cannot rule out interfering events outside of the intervention. So for example, if there are news articles about the detrimental effects of obesity in children, this is something that behavioral investigators and also statisticians are concerned about, that the assessment may affect the outcome. If you ask people how stressed they are, they may start thinking about how stressed they are. So they may give a very different answer the second time you ask them than the first time that you ask them. And we cannot rule out regression to the mean, which means the more extreme a score is, the more likely it is to be closer to the mean at a later measurement. So questions about the pre-post design. We'll get back to the example. Okay, so then based on our pilot data, we submitted an R01 grant. Dr. Hingle is very good at coming up with acronyms, so Encourage, Practice, and Inspire Change in Families was EPIC. Now we were going to do a randomized trial to test the efficacy of a family-based type 2 diabetes prevention program on excess weight. We'll talk about the proximal indicators of TD2 risk and lifestyle behaviors. And we plan to accrue 160 intervention, 160 control families across multiple YMCA sites located in medically underserved areas in Tucson and Phoenix. Now, these are the specific aims. I'm not going to go through them in detail. This was an R01 grant, so we had very detailed specific aims. The first one was related to adiposity of the kids. HOMA-IR, which is a measure of insulin resistance. diet quality, physical activity, and sleep, and time spent in sedentary behavior. And then this gets into the program implementation parts of it, including acceptability, adoption, and factors influencing sustainability, because of course we didn't want the intervention to disappear when the grant funding ended. Okay. Now here's an example of a very nice flow diagram. Okay. We anticipated that we would need to screen 2,200 families. Of those, 80% would be ineligible. We expected that 20% would be eligible, 20 to 30% would not be interested, so we would enroll 320, and then we would have 160 in the lifestyle intervention, which was going to continue for 6 months, versus the control. We would test them again at 6 months and notice that we allowed up to 25% attrition. Then we would have further follow-up from 6 months to 12 months. And among those in the control group, they would be able to participate in the intervention. One of the unique aspects of this design is that we were not randomizing individuals to the intervention or control within a YMCA, because we were concerned about contamination within a Y, so that at any given interval, each Y had only the intervention or a control condition, so that then in the next year, if they had intervention in the year previously, they would have the control in the next year. So if you note, we have 16 cohorts of individuals, okay? And we'll talk about that clustering in a minute, because the sample size justification had to accommodate the fact that individuals within a particular Y, especially since this was a face-to-face intervention, might behave more similarly than individuals in different years, even within the same Y. So we based our sample size on the mean change in the BMI Z-score from the EPIC KID study. We assumed that there would be 16 clusters. These are our clusters, and we allowed 20 dyads per cluster. We allowed up to 25% attrition, so 120 per group at 6 months. And then we did have 2 primary outcomes, the BMI Z-score and insulin resistance. So that means I adjusted the alpha level using Bonferroni, which means I divided it in 2. So our sample size justification was based on an alpha level of 0.025. Okay. So this just shows how you need to go beyond just saying, okay, I'm going to do a paired t-test, to account for things like the fact that we may have correlation within a cluster, and also co-primary endpoints. So questions about the example? Okay, so that my statistical power is over 95%, as long as my intra-cluster correlation is 0.2 or below. And for HOMA-IR, we did the sample size justification in terms of a standardized difference, which is the mean divided by the standard deviation. We would be able to detect a standardized difference of 0.9. It turns out that one of our co-investigators demonstrated a much smaller standardized difference in obese Latino adolescents. So if we assume this effect size, then we would have greater than 90% statistical power. Okay, so this is what I hope I've been able to talk about, is demystifying the process of consulting with a statistician, what you bring to the collaboration, the importance of the specific aims page, what I bring to the collaboration and the grant sections that I prepare, and then just a short discussion of statistical landmines. So general questions. Okay, so then I will stop the share. And Maria, can I ask for your help in terms of calling on the early stage investigators? So we have, it says there's 15 participants. We have probably 5 or 6 senior investigators on the call. So that means each of you would have probably about 3 to 4 minutes. So Maria, can you help me, or should I just go through the list?
I can help you, Denise.
Okay.
So I know 2 ESIs who have been really busy lately, so let's see if they might have something. And I guess I'll pick on the Wildcat first. So Julie Arman.
Sure.
Hi, Julie.
Heather, hi. How are you, Denise?
Good.
Heather can chime in. And so we are, there you are, Heather. You're interested in knowing what we're working on and what our next steps are.
Yes, and I know
okay.
you work with Melanie Bell, don't you?
I have in the past, yeah. I mean, Melanie
Okay.
and I have worked together on, we've both been co-investigators with Judith Gordon. But on
Okay.
our project, we're working with Janet Rothers, who,
Oh, I know Janet.
you know.
Yes. Uh-huh.
Yeah. And so Janet is a co-investigator on our team. And so we're currently in the process of adapting a cancer screening education program that was developed for women with intellectual disabilities, and we're adapting it in partnership with our community partners. And we're getting ready to do feasibility and acceptability testing next year, early next year. And just kind of exploring some of those preliminary outcomes that, as you mentioned, regarding knowledge, self-efficacy, and then just this morning, Heather and Janet and I met to talk about a planned submission for the next step after we've done the feasibility testing next year. Heather, I don't want to put you on the spot. Do you want to talk about that?
We just started talking about it, so there's not really much for me to say, to be totally honest. So, but basically, you know, kind of the next steps we were thinking about for the next phases is obviously, this first phase is really small, as Julie mentioned, for feasibility acceptability. So obviously we'd be looking at a bigger sample size, and we haven't really gotten much further beyond the sense of talking about, we visualize the next phase being more looking at kind of testing components of the curriculum, as well as the outcomes from being part of the curriculum, to kind of see, you know, when I say components, like it's the who's delivering it, how it's being delivered, you know, kind of really pulling out some more specific testing of those components to see which parts of the components have more of a kind of an impact on the outcome. It's a design called MOST design, what we were talking about, which I don't know, hold on, I have it in front of me. I can make sure I say it correctly. It's the multi-phase optimization strategy approach is like the research design that we're thinking about. Yeah, I think that's as far as we've gotten.
Yeah. So how many, are you doing both women and men?
So it's a breast and cervical cancer screening education program. So it's just for the women. And in addition to that, some of our preliminary work identified that we should also involve a caregiver in the educational program. So it's a dyad approach. So we're actually kind of looking at knowledge and attitudes, self-efficacy above the women themselves, and also their support person, caregiver.
Okay. And then what age range?
So this is adults. So these are at the ages at which you would be needing to get those cancer screenings, right?
Okay.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay.
18 and up.
18 and up, yeah.
18 and up for cervical cancer, right?
Mhm, mhm.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that sounds really interesting. So, where are you hoping to submit? You said next year you're thinking about a grant
Mhm.
application. Where are you hoping to submit?
We were looking at the R34 mechanism.
Uh-huh.
Probably NIMHD.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So, remind me, the R34, is that the one with the pilot and then, or is it just a, it's a full grant?
It's a full grant, but it allows for a randomized control feasibility trial so that you can test out it expects you to do
Okay.
a feasibility trial. So we were thinking we would do the most component tests, prior to doing the randomized feasibility trial. It is a 3-year grant, so it seems like there might be time enough to do that if we focus the component testing.
And can you do this solely in Tucson, or do you have to go to Phoenix also to get enough women?
Well, that currently we have 2 partners, and we would continue the partnership with them, Hopi Cancer Support Services and Tucson Indian Center.
Okay.
And so really the feasibility and acceptability test will be that will tell us if we need to go to Phoenix, I would imagine, for the next phase.
Yeah.
Although the hope is, I mean, we've already talked to people thanks to Heather's chattiness at a hotel lobby. We've already talked to people who have, some interest in expanding this at, more broadly in other states. I meant that in a good way, Heather. I should say your
My networking skills.
networking
Yes.
networking skills. Thank you. That's it.
Mhm. Yeah. Okay. No, that sounds really interesting. And I know you've kind of really identified a niche population. So that will help you. That will help improve your chances of success.
Denise, I have a question for you. As I was glad that Heather remembered that caregivers are part of our intervention, and because our kind of primary outcome is that the women themselves get their mammogram or pap smear. For the project that you worked on, the EPIC Families project, what was the endpoint or the outcome for the family member? Was it just outcomes for the children?
It was just the physical outcomes were just for the kids, but the outcomes like the family food environment, that was from the families. And Terry Badger has done a lot of work, as you probably know, with dyads and the analysis of dyads. So she would be a really good source. Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, Maria, who's next?
So I know somebody who might be kind of early stage with a K award. I don't know if she's ready for prime time yet, but Chelsea, do you have anything that you might want to ask Denise?
So it's Chesley, and I'm still in the preliminary steps of the K, but I am submitting a SHRC pilot project, and I am going to review my specific aims. There's a grant writing workshop this week with an ACP, so
Good.
I think the hard part is that for me, I'm wanting to do a study using mobile health technology as an intervention for alcohol consumption in Native American population experiencing homelessness.
Mhm.
And the feedback I keep getting in terms of the pilot study is that I really need to narrow my focus. But at the same time, I have to justify how, because it's a development grant, I have to justify how it will lead to greater funding, like a greater funding
Mhm.
award in the future. So I had 3 levels planned. The first level is to get like a cultural and community working definition of homelessness,
Mhm.
because we know Native Americans who are homeless are very different than the general population, and they can fall into under and overutilization of services.
Mhm.
So that was going to be my qualitative component. And then I wanted to evaluate alcohol use at the same time in order to develop my ecological momentary assessment protocol.
Mhm.
So my question would be, specifically, when I'm told to narrow things down for my specific aims, is it okay to have specific aims that we will, one, just first and foremost qualify what homelessness is in my population, and then 2, gain an understanding of alcohol use, because we don't know if we have binge drinkers or like largely abstainers who have infrequent episodes of problematic drinking or what, but we do know that alcohol contributes significantly to a lot of the mental health issues and then extending the time of homelessness. So I want to capture all of that. And is that enough for specific aims?
Well, for a planning grant, yes.
Okay.
Because in essence, it seems to me like what you're trying to do is you're trying to define the prevalence of both conditions,
Mhm.
right? The prevalence of experiencing homelessness, and then within that subset, the prevalence with alcohol abuse.
Mhm.
So that it seems to me that yes, that's a very important piece for you. Um, and then the question I would have is, I mean, I know there are validated questionnaires for alcohol abuse, but are there any validated in the tribes that you propose to study?
That's a good question. Not really, no.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the research on the different instruments has been mostly established ones, and does this work when we apply it to specific tribes? And the results are really mixed. Some of them
Mhm.
work with tribes, some of them really aren't applicable.
Yeah. Yeah. So that is a limitation that you'll need to overcome.
Mhm.
And but you can just have that in your limitations and alternative approaches,
Okay.
section. Just acknowledge it. And then if your overall goal is to develop a mobile health app, what do you want the mobile health app to provide them?
So I'm primarily trained in ecological momentary assessment and just-in-time adaptive interventions. And so
Mhm.
I would want to use the just-in-time model to get, so based on the definitions of homelessness and alcohol consumption, I would know like what settings are the greatest risk for
Mhm.
drinking behaviors.
Mhm.
And so if it's when somebody reports that they're staying with family that they don't have a great relationship with, I also want to monitor in there, which is part of my big research, is stress and discrimination leading to poor health behavior or negative health
Mhm.
behaviors.
Mhm.
And so I would want to design the algorithm to detect like the right level of stress, the right level of discrimination, the right level of poor coping and the environment to trigger the just-in-time responses to say,
Mhm.
okay, the situation looks like you're at risk for drinking, and you're working not to do that, or you're working to reduce your drinking.
Mhm.
Do you want to try one of these interventions?
Mhm.
And so that's the model I would want the app to be framed around.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, that is a very um that's a lot.
Yeah.
Because and then that would be an AI, an artificial intelligence type app, or is there really someone at the other end? Kind of an
Um,
AI type model.
so it would probably be a mix. Like we would offer the opportunity to call like a national healthline or
Mhm.
helpline. So there would be somebody connected there. There are two of us who are counseling psychologists, so we really
Mhm.
do want like a true clinical component, but it's not something that we can offer. So if we shoot 6 prompts a day to get all
Mhm.
of that data that we want, we can't guarantee somebody, unless it's us,
Yeah.
that is available 24 hours. And so
Mhm.
that's a component where we've been like, well, maybe we develop like an intervention app, we connect to some helpline, and then we can plug in maybe their primary support people so that you can choose like call my friend, call my
Mhm.
sponsor, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So it would probably mostly be AI just
Mhm.
because it's tricky.
Yeah, no, it would be tricky. Okay, so getting back to your first question, um, I think you may have to do it kind of sequentially. Define homelessness first,
Mhm.
then among those that are homeless. But why do you want to focus just on those who are homeless? I mean, alcohol abuse is an issue for those who are not homeless also.
Definitely. So, the I mean, the very simple and uninteresting thing is that this came out of a possible collaboration with Washington State.
Uh-huh.
And so, it was an area where one of the PIs there and I we're just looking into the homeless communities in our areas.
Mhm.
So, that's the basic part of it. But in doing a literature review for that potential collaboration, I became more interested because all of these tribal grants and papers published on natives experiencing homelessness would have these like caveat statements of the Native American population in our sample behaved very differently than the general population.
Yeah.
They
Mhm.
they didn't view themselves as homeless, or they were more transient, or they followed jobs, but they were comfortable camping out and then only coming in for health or food services.
Mhm.
And so just seeing it repeated over and over, I was like, okay, there's something interesting going on here. And a lot of the studies show that you know, Native Americans are really high abstainers from alcohol.
Mhm.
Yet in homeless populations like in Flagstaff, a lot of the crimes or police response incidents are related to alcohol. So that that got me just really thinking about how there's probably something unique going on in two different levels.
Mhm. Yeah. No, it sounds like a fascinating proposal. And in essence, it probably is true. If you focus on those who are homeless, you might up your prevalence of alcohol abuse. So
Mhm.
then you might identify more individuals who can be the target for your app.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, it sounds like an interesting proposal.
Awesome. Thank you. And thanks for the feedback.
So are you developing it into a K, or do you have a K award?
So the K Award I'm working on and discussing with my mentors. And so it will likely be more cancer focused.
Mhm.
And so that's in progress. Meeting with Dr. Ingram on Friday, and then I have my PI at University of Utah, who
Mhm.
also has lots of opinions.
Yeah, and boy, I didn't say that in part of the presentation, but yes, part of what you and others as early stage investigators have to manage is the conflicting advice from multiple people. So, it's okay to take it all in and then to say, all right, but this is what I'm choosing to do.
Mhm. Yes, thank you. I'm working on it. I've got a good, really great support network here at NAU, and I'm glad to be here because I feel like it is more flexible here, and my postdoc PI just has lots of opinions.
Yeah, good, good. Well, even though you're at NAU, please contact me when you need help.
Oh,
And
excellent.
especially since you're at NAU, well, now no one can walk into my office. But, yeah, especially contact me when you need help.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.
Mhm.
And thanks, Maria, for.
Okay.
So one of our investigators on one of our pilot project is on Powell. So I don't know if you guys are working on something that you might like to. I know you have worked with Denise, so.
Hi, Pavel.
Denise. Yes, we've been working on lots of projects, and I'm kind of like non-typical early investigator because I'm just the research scientist, so I cannot really apply for my own grants, but I'm helping here Dr. Herb Skralovec to get some fundings, and we're working together with Denise on multiple projects. So the biggest is our endometrial cancer study. So we're learning a lot, and especially with all those conditions that women have going under hysterectomy, we have lots of already conversations about the groupings and analyze the data properly. Because of them, women have those multiple conditions, and you cannot really predict until they go under hysterectomy, and that's what they figure out at the path. Results. But another study that we just starting is the Flynn grant, that it's a bridge grant that we funded for the feasibility study. So I think this is going to be very exciting because we got the R01 pretty well scored, and the biggest issue we had, it was already some time ago because unfortunately, this bridge study was a little delayed because of the COVID, of course. So I think Elisa, our research coordinator, she's planning to start recruiting our patients. So for that feasibility study, we want to do the microbiome analysis in women with cervical cancer or cervical precancer. So we published multiple papers already from our previous cohort, but it was a cross-sectional study. And of course, the best step for that would be to show the causation. And of course, we cannot show any causation with microbiome and development of those cervical neoplasia. So the longitudinal design, it's the step that we need to take to see more if the microbiome changes, and this causes the change in the neoplastic disease or HPV persistence, or it's opposite, that the HPV that persists is going to change your microbiome, so the effect can be opposite. But I think for this feasibility study, we cannot, of course, propose that because it's not enough time. I think it was one year grant. So I think it's only more about if we able to recruit the patients and they're gonna be okay with multiple self-collection as well. So there's a couple differences what happened, to our previous study. First one is this longitudinal aspect. So the women needs to be collected multiple times. And then there's the self-collection because they're not coming to clinic, sometimes years, sometimes 3 years, depends on their PAP results. They don't need to come back to the clinic. So we're gonna explore if they're okay with the self-collection and sending us the samples from their homes. So that would be I think the biggest aspect of that grant proposal, that it's needed to add it to this revised R01 to show that we're feasible to recruit number of the patients. I think the number, it's not the big issue because we already work with ValueWise earlier, and we can say how many we collected during the whatever time period we work with them. But again, it's because it's a different type of the collection, self-collection. I think we need to prove it that we're not gonna have problem to get enough an amount of the samples. And I think initially we proposed in this bridge to recruit 100 women to see how many of those really gonna send us the whole set of the samples. And we also, I think, trying to figure out if how many of those self-collection we can get back, because it would be nice to have as much as more. So we proposed 4 self-collections every month. But like even from the minimum that we would like to get is at least 2 self-collections, so we know what's happening with this 2-month period. But then we added those extra samples to just also for our information, if we can collect those samples through self-collection for a longer time. So that's what's starting now. So we're gonna probably, that's gonna be something to analyze hopefully next year when we're gonna get some kind of first results in self-collections.
Yes, and you know, for the others, having been involved with the initial R01 submission, that's a really difficult review to get back, that they just don't think it's feasible. You know, it's one thing if they, you know, if they question part of the science, you know, well, that you can kind of just, you know, refute. But feasibility, you're right. We really do just have to show it. We can't just, you know, say, oh, yes, this is feasible for us.
And what you said, like that you cannot base that on any previous results, because again, that's the specific place, specific hospital. The settings can be different in that hospital versus other hospital. And if nobody done it before, then you really need to do this feasibility study, right?
Yes.
To just prove it.
Okay, well, I'm sure we'll be talking in the future.
Yep.
I know we'll be talking in the future. You're on my calendar.
Right. Thank you, Denise.
Oh, you're welcome. Maria?
Yeah, so we can head back up to NIU and see Regina.
Hi.
Hi.
Sorry for the lighting. It looks like I'm in the dark here. Yeah, so for me, so I'm just starting a pilot project. So I got funded through SSHRC, and my area of focus is really looking at school-based research. And what I'm specifically looking at right now in the next couple of years is looking at school wellness, both policies and practices, using an instrument. So part of this pilot study, I'm looking to also gather qualitative data. And then in looking at this to kind of build, to gain a good understanding, kind of a baseline understanding, because I think kind of what we all agree on, you know, with American Indian Health, you know, there's, you know, hardly any data. So, and that's kind of this, the same here in school health and wellness. You know, if there is, you know, it's maybe region specific, et cetera. So I'm looking at schools on the Navajo Nation. So in looking forward, I think my goal, I think, would be really to, you know, begin to build off, you know, I guess kind of after these findings, preliminary findings, have a good understanding, you know, in terms of policies. From a policy perspective, implementation is one aspect, but then also, you know, to develop policies that support, you know, healthy practices in school. So, you know, I think some of this would probably involve, I'm really interested in cultural foods, intervention in the school setting, for example, school lunch programs. So just a lot of, with the environmental, but, kind of what I'm, just hearing your presentation, it seems like, when it comes to like recruitment, sample size, if that's going to be an issue for me, just because right now, on Navajo, but maybe, may need to consider, I guess, going outside, to other tribal nations, schools, but, I think that's still, far in my planning at this point, but those are just kind of some thoughts that I have, looking forward to kind of the next steps of, submitting proposals.
Yes, and I do work with some investigators who are involved with schools here in Tucson, and as you know, the main thing is getting the buy-in from the schools.
Yeah.
And I know right now with COVID, that might be really difficult, because of all the other issues that they're facing. I also think you should, you're kind of in an in-between state right now with COVID. Really think about the policies you want to be able to impact. So in other words, do you want healthier school lunches? What do you want those to look at? Do you want to mandate that they are outside, half an hour a day, a lot of weather permitting? I know it gets very cold on the Navajo Nation at times, but what are the policies? If you're interested at the policy level, what are the policies that you want to impact? I like your approach of starting with qualitative data, because that would tell you what's currently happening. And then, also, moving towards being able to, to make sure that you have enough schools and enough kids within the schools. You may not want to target the whole school. You may want to target the older kids or the younger kids, wherever you think that you can have the most impact.
Yeah. Well, thank you on that feedback. Yeah. I think that's kind of an area where, based on this, where can improvements in certain aspects of, these required policies that schools are supposed to have in place. But then the other part of that too, though, is kind of, the implementation piece. It's one thing to have a policy in place, but another aspect is, how is it being implemented into practice, as well. But thank you for that feedback.
Well, and I also am working with some investigators who are very interested in food security. So that might be something that would play in also, if the kids are getting breakfast and lunch, how much of it is going to the kid at school versus going in their pocket for their little brother at home. So I think, kind of also being just aware of things like that.
Indeed. Thank you.
Do we have time for more, Denise?
Sure, one more.
And real quick before I call on the last person, Kelly Lorela, our evaluator for NACP, has put a link in the chat box. And so if everybody who has attended the workshop could fill that out, it would be very helpful to NACP. Kelly, did you want to say anything specific about it?
No, just please take a couple minutes to give us feedback. It helps us shape these workshops in the future and inform how they can be better and what was working really well about them. We appreciate it.
Well, and I'd very much ask you to fill that out also, because when Dr. Highmark first approached me about giving a workshop on biostatistics, I teach a year-long course, And I thought, well, no one is going to want to sit in an hour and a half distillation of a year-long course. So, I kind of just thought about other groups that I've worked with and what seemed to be helpful. But let me know if this worked. Because, if it doesn't, you'll help the next group. And if it does, let me know the parts that you think worked well. And, the parts that, yeah, you can just skip that next time. So it will help me also. So thank you.
Great. How about Ken? I know Ken has lots of projects going on.
Hello. Yeah, I do have a lot of projects. So my primary interest right now is kidney cancer, and my research is actually have two aspects. One is more behavioral aspect, and I recently got R21 grant, so I'm working on that, and we just getting ready to recruit the patients to interview. So I just see how it's going to turn out. I cannot say anything about the next step from this project at this point very much. So other aspect is my molecular study of kidney cancer to show that Hispanic patients that also maybe a Native American patients have a different molecular or metabolomic characteristic from non-Hispanic white patients. And I have a lot of small pilot grants I got from Cancer Center and the foundation. And so I'm just trying to put all the data together to see what I can do next step. So I was hoping to write R01 targeting this next winter or summer before my ESI status expire. But again, I just have to put all the preliminary data together to see that what I can do and how I can focus for my R01. Also, I have other pending grant with from the DoD. So if that comes through, probably I'll wait to apply for R01 as well. So it's just the waiting period between having grant project going, trying to produce data, and trying to figure out what's the next step.
Yeah. And you work with Paul Su, right?
Yes. So for the R01, R21 for the kidney cancer project. Also, I work for the HOPI project. I work with the Paul Su. And for the molecular aspect, I usually talk to Jinzhou, or I have talked to, I cannot say his name really good,
Xiao, yes.
Yeah, I've talked to him a couple of times and gave me some suggestions. So yes, I usually talk to somebody, biostatistics, that is appropriate for my project and see what they think. And
yeah. Well, good, because I know you've been writing a lot of grants.
Yeah, I know you've written a lot of my grants.
Yeah. So I would also just say to the others who haven't had a chance to share what they've been doing, you have my email. Please email me. I mean, I'm the director of the Biostatistics Shared Resource for the Cancer Center. We have 5 faculty level statisticians that have various pieces that provide statistical support. The other thing that I have is several master's level statisticians. So if you need help with any just data analysis, we're here to help with that. Yeah, Maria, is there anything else?
Yes, I'll just mention real quick, just to remind everybody, the early stage investigators and junior investigators that are involved in guides, NACP will support your biostatistics, whether you're working for a manuscript or a grant. So don't hesitate, because you've got that paid for through us. So it's an opportunity to take advantage of that.
I have a question about that. So do we just email, I guess, Denise directly or from NAU? So
Yeah, no, email me directly. Yeah, I've worked with several people from NAU already. So yeah, just email me directly. And it helps me. I tell my students this also, put NACP in the subject line, because I'm sure it's true for the rest of you too, I get between 300 and 400 emails a day. So, if you put NACP, I'll make it a point to make sure that, okay, I read that one and respond to you. So yeah, but please just email me directly, drowe@arizona.edu.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, and then Denise will just bill us. Okay.
Yeah. And if you want to make sure it happens, CC Maria, because then she'll make sure that I respond. Okay, well, thank you very much for the opportunity. And I look forward to talking with many of you in the future.
Thank you,
I want to
Denise.
thank you also, Denise. Very, very good. Very informative.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
Denise.
you. Bye, Denise.
Bye-bye.